Have you ever considered what a person is worth when the world has already decided they are worthless? In the summer of 1883, in the dust-choked territory of Montana, a man named Jacob Vance was about to find out. He was a man well acquainted with loss, and the townsfolk of Redemption Springs figured he was just adding another bad bargain to a long list. But the mail-order bride who stepped off the noon stage was more than just an unwanted soul. She was a secret, and that secret was about to save everything he had left. The heat was a physical weight that summer, pressing down on the parched grass of Jacob's modest ranch. It baked the life from the land and seemed to leach the hope right out of a man's bones. Jacob felt it in his own joints, a weariness that had little to do with the sun. His spread, nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek that was now just a ribbon of mud, was failing. His cattle were thin, the market was unforgiving, and his best stallion, a creature of midnight black named Obsidian, was dying. The horse was the last vestige of his pride, the final living link to a dream that was turning to dust around him. That was why he'd sent for a bride. Not for love, or even for companionship in the traditional sense. He had sent for a pair of hands, another soul to throw against the relentless tide of failure. The agency had sent him Lin Way. The town had laughed. They were still laughing. Jacob could hear their sneers carried on the hot breeze every time he rode in for supplies. Bartholomew Thorne, the imperious baron whose land dwarfed all others, had sent for a dozen Chinese laborers and a bride for his foreman. The laborers arrived. The bride, he'd rejected on sight, sending her back to the agency with a note of disgust. The agency, desperate to be rid of her, had offered her to the next man on their list for the price of her ticket. That man was Jacob Vance. When she arrived, she was a ghost in a simple white prairie dress, her face as pale and still as porcelain. She stood on the platform with a single worn carpet bag, her dark eyes taking in the jeering faces of the town loafers without a flicker of emotion. She was small, younger than he'd expected, barely 18 by his guess. She looked as fragile as a sparrow. Jacob, a man built of broad shoulders and grim silence, simply nodded, took her bag, and led her to his horse. He didn't offer a hand up. He didn't need to. She moved with a fluid grace that surprised him, mounting the spare mare in one smooth motion. The ride back to the ranch was silent, the air thick with the buzzing of cicadas and an unspoken tension. He showed her the small, clean room off the main cabin, the one his own wife had occupied a lifetime ago. He pointed to the well, the woodpile, the kitchen. He spoke in simple, direct terms, assuming she understood little. You cook, you clean, you mend. That is the arrangement. She just watched him, her gaze unnerving in its steadiness. She gave a single, sharp nod. That first evening she prepared a meal of rice from her own dwindling supplies and some salted pork he had. It was plain but filling. They ate in silence at the rough-hewn table, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and the mournful whine of the wind outside. The arrangement felt less like a marriage and more like the hiring of a silent, watchful servant. He was beginning to think the town was right. He had bought himself another burden. The next morning the heat had not broken. Jacob went to the stable, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. The stable was his sanctuary, the one place that felt wholly his. The scent of hay and horse and old leather was the only scripture he knew, but today it smelled of sickness. Obsidian was down in his stall, his magnificent black coat matted with sweat, his breathing a ragged, shallow thing. The horse's head lay flat in the straw, his eyes glassy and dull. Doc Miller, the closest thing Redemption had to a veterinarian, had been out the day before. He'd shaken his head, his face grim. It's a lung fever, Jacob. I've seen it take down whole herds. There's naught to be done. Best to be merciful. Jacob had paid the man his $1 and sent him on his way. the word merciful echoing in the quiet barn. Now, standing over the animal, he knew the man was right. To let him suffer was a cruelty he couldn't stomach. He went to the tack room and returned with his Colt, the metal cool and heavy in his hand. He chambered around, the click sounding like a death knell in the oppressive silence. He raised the pistol, his own breath catching in his throat, his vision blurring for just a second. This was it, the end of the line, the end of the dream. And then a shadow fell across the straw. Lin Wei stood at the entrance to the stall, her white dress a stark contrast to the gloom. She said nothing. She simply stepped forward, placing her small body directly between Jacob and the horse's head. He froze, the gun still raised. "Move aside, miss," he growled, his voice rough with unshed grief. She did not move. Instead, she knelt in the filthy straw, her dress forgotten. She reached out a slender hand and laid it on Obsidian's sweat-soaked neck. Her touch was impossibly gentle. She looked up at Jacob, her dark eyes shining with an intensity that stunned him. For the first time she spoke to him in halting, heavily accented English. "No, not done. I help." Jacob stared at her, the Colt feeling suddenly foolish and obscene in his grip. The entire situation was absurd. This slip of a girl who he'd brought here to cook his meals and darn his socks was telling him she could save a horse that a seasoned veterinarian had condemned. He could feel a bitter laugh rising in his chest. Everything was a joke. His ranch, his life, this strange phantom of a marriage. "There's nothing to be done," he said, his voice flat. "The doc said so. It's a fever of the lungs. He's drowning from the inside." He expected her to shrink back, to accept his word as law. She was, after all, his property in the eyes of the world, a woman with no standing and no voice. But she didn't shrink. She shook her head, a small, fierce gesture. She ran her hand along Obsidian's neck, her fingers finding a pressure point just behind the ear. The great horse, who had been struggling for every breath, suddenly went still, a low sigh escaping his lips. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but Jacob, who knew this animal better than he knew himself, saw it. The tension in the horse's frame eased, just for a moment. Lin looked up at him again, her gaze unwavering. "I know horse," she whispered, the words carrying a certainty that defied her broken English. "My family, we know horse. Please." The word "please" hung in the air between them. It was not a plea for the horse's life, he realized. It was a plea for his trust. He looked from her determined face to the suffering animal on the floor. He was a desperate man, and desperate men make foolish wagers. What more did he have to lose? His pride was already gone. His hope was a flickering ember. Maybe this was just one last mad gamble before the darkness took everything. He lowered the pistol, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. He uncocked the hammer with a soft click and holstered the weapon. He felt a profound sense of surrender, a letting go of the last vestiges of control. "All right," he rumbled, the word tasting like rust in his mouth. "He's yours. You save him. You've earned your keep and then some. He dies. He dies." He turned and walked out of the stable without looking back, leaving her alone with the dying horse and the impossible promise she had made. He did not see the look of fierce, resolute purpose that settled on her face as she bent to her work. He established the new rules of their strange cohabitation with a gruff reluctance. Her place was no longer just the kitchen and the cabin. It was the stable. He moved a cot into an empty stall, along with a bucket for washing and a small stack of clean linens. He didn't want the sickness, whatever it was, brought into the house. It was a practical measure, but it felt like something more. It felt like drawing a line, separating her world from his. He would watch, but he would not help. This was her trial. He expected her to protest, to balk at sleeping in a barn like an animal herself. Instead, she accepted the arrangement with that same quiet nod. She moved her few belongings from the spare room to the stall, her worn carpet bag and a small, intricately embroidered silk pouch that he'd never seen her open. She seemed more at home there, amidst the scent of hay and sickness, than she ever had in the sterile silence of the cabin. From a distance he observed her methods. They were nothing like the frontier remedies he knew. She didn't dose the horse with whiskey or bleed him with a dirty knife. Instead, she spent hours roaming the parched hillsides around the ranch, her white dress a moving speck against the brown landscape. She returned with her apron full of roots, weeds, and wildflowers he would have trampled underfoot without a second thought. She would grind these into pastes and poultices, using a smooth river stone as a pestle. The air in the stable began to change, the sharp odor of decay slowly being replaced by the pungent, earthy smells of herbs and crushed leaves. She would brew teas in a small pot over a fire she built just outside the stable doors, steaming concoctions that she would painstakingly coax down Obsidian's throat, a spoonful at a time. She spoke to the horse constantly, not in English, but in a soft, melodic tongue that sounded like flowing water. It was a language of comfort, of reassurance. Jacob would stand in the shadow of the cabin watching her work by lantern light late into the night, her small form moving with tireless grace. He was a man who valued work above all else, and he had never seen anyone work like this. She moved with a devotion that was almost spiritual. She was not just tending to a sick animal. She was fighting a war. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of heat, dust, and vigilant care. Jacob kept his distance, handling the other ranch duties, his mind constantly drifting back to the drama unfolding in his stable. The other horses, a small but sturdy herd of quarter horses he prized for their agility and temperament, grew restless. They could smell the sickness on the air, and their unease was a low thrum of energy that kept Jacob on edge. Yet when Lynn was near, they seemed calm. He watched one afternoon as she walked through the corral and the herd parted for her as if she were one of them, their ears pricked forward, their nostrils soft. They were not afraid of her. They were curious, respectful. It was unnatural. Horses were creatures of instinct, wary of strangers, yet they accepted her presence without question. That evening, as he brought her a plate of food, he found her not with Obsidian, but sitting on an overturned bucket, her hands gently massaging the swollen leg of his best cutting mare, Daisy. He had assumed the mare had been kicked, a common enough injury. Lynn looked up at him, her hands never ceasing their rhythmic motion. "Tendon," she said, her voice soft. "Strained. Not bad, but need rest." He had been planning to ride Daisy out to check the fences the next morning. He grunted, a non-committal sound, that he didn't argue. He knew horses, had worked them his entire life. He knew the signs of a serious injury, and while he hadn't seen it himself, the authority in her voice gave him pause. The next morning he took another horse. That decision, a small concession to her knowledge, felt like a crack in the fortress of his skepticism. Later that day, from the ridge overlooking the valley, he saw a lone rider. The man sat his horse for a long time, a silhouette against the blazing sky, simply watching the ranch. Jacob's hand went to the Winchester in its scabbard. It was probably just a drifting hand, but something about the stillness of the figure prickled the back of his neck. The rider eventually turned and disappeared over the rise. A re-hook of tension pulled tight in his gut. The quiet of his valley had been disturbed, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him despite the heat, that the worst of it had not yet arrived. On the fifth day, something changed. When Jacob entered the stable with the morning bucket of fresh water, he found Obsidian standing. The horse was shaky on his legs, his frame gaunt, but he was on his feet. His head was up, and his eyes, though still dull, were clear. Lynn was standing beside him, stroking his neck, murmuring to him in her native tongue. She looked up as Jacob approached, and for the first time he saw a flicker of a smile touch her lips. It transformed her face, softening the stoic mask she always wore, revealing the young woman beneath. He stopped dead, the bucket sloshing water onto the dirt floor. He had been so certain the horse was going to die. He had prepared himself for it, had walled off that part of his heart to avoid the pain. But here he was, alive. He walked closer, running a hand down Obsidian's flank. The fever had broken. The horse's skin was cool to the touch. He leaned his head against the animal's side, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. It was no longer a ragged gasp. It was the sound of life. He felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He turned to Lynn, who was watching him with her dark, knowing eyes. He didn't have the words to express the gratitude, the sheer, dumbfounded awe he felt. "How?" was all he could manage, his voice a hoarse whisper. She simply tapped the small silk pouch that was now tied at her waist. "Old way," she said, "from my home." It was then that the dust of a fast-approaching rider announced a visitor. Jacob's hand instinctively went to his hip. He stepped out of the stable, squinting into the glare, and felt his gut clench. It was Bartholomew Thorne, flanked by two of his hard-faced hired men. Thorne rode a magnificent silver mare that looked as pampered and arrogant as its owner. He dismounted with a flourish, his tailored coat and polished boots an insult to the dusty poverty of Jacob's ranch. Thorne's eyes swept over the place with unconcealed disdain before they landed on Lynn as she emerged from the stable behind Jacob. A cruel, knowing smirk spread across Thorne's face. "Well, well, Vance," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see you took my table scraps. I trust you paid a fair price for damaged goods." Jacob stepped forward, placing himself between Thorne and Lynn. "She's my wife, Thorne, and this is my property. State your business or get off it." Thorne laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Wife? You dignify it with that word? I sent for a worker, not a pet. When she arrived, I saw she was unfit. I have standards." His eyes raked over Lynn, making her flinch. It was then that Thorne's gaze drifted past Jacob into the dim interior of the stable. His eyes widened. He had seen Obsidian. "I'll be damned," he breathed, pushing past Jacob. "That's the stallion Miller said was as good as dead." He walked up to Obsidian, running a hand over the horse's coat with a feigned expertise. "A remarkable recovery, truly. A beast like this is wasted on a dirt scratcher like you, Vance. I'll give you $500 for him. A generous offer, considering your circumstances." Jacob's anger, a cold and steady thing, began to burn. "He's not for sale." Thorne's smile vanished. "Everything is for sale, Vance. It's just a matter of finding the right price, or applying the right pressure." His gaze shifted back to Lynn, a clear and ugly threat. It was in that moment Jacob understood. Thorne didn't just want the horse. He wanted to humiliate the man who had taken what he'd discarded, and to possess the woman who, by her very survival, had defied his judgment. The secret was out. Lynn was not just some unwanted bride. She was the daughter of a master of horses, a woman whose knowledge was a treasure. And Bartholomew Thorne was a man who collected treasures, by any means necessary. The confrontation with Thorne changed the air on the ranch. The oppressive heat of the summer sun was replaced by the cold chill of a coming conflict. The unspoken truce between Jacob and Lynn, the careful distance they had maintained, dissolved. They were no longer just a man and his purchased wife. They were partners, allied against a common enemy. The stable became their council room, the quiet presence of the recovering Obsidian their witness. That evening Jacob did not leave her a plate of food at the stable door. He brought 2 plates and a lantern and sat on an old crate opposite the bucket she used as a chair. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a mutual respect forged in the crucible of the last week. "He will be back," Jacob said, breaking the quiet. It was not a question. Lynn nodded, her eyes fixed on her plate. "He wants the horse. He wants—" She trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. Jacob's jaw tightened. The thought of Thorn putting his hands on her sent a surge of protective fury through him, a feeling so primal and fierce it startled him. "He won't touch you," he growled, the words a solemn vow. "And he won't touch these horses." She looked up at him then, and he saw a vulnerability in her eyes that she had kept hidden. "In my home," she began, her English slow but deliberate, "a man like him, he takes what he wants. My father taught me about horses. He did not teach me about men like that." Jacob thought of the war, of the things he had seen men do for power and greed. "I know about men like that," he said, his voice grim. "The only thing they understand is strength." A summer storm, which had been threatening for days, finally broke that night. Lightning flashed, illuminating the stable in stark, momentary tableaus. Thunder rolled through the valley, shaking the very timbers of the barn. The horses grew agitated, their whinnies sharp with fear. Without a word, both Jacob and Lynn rose and moved among them. He took one side of the stable, she took the other. He spoke in low, calming tones, running his calloused hands over strong necks and twitching flanks. He watched her across the aisle, her small form moving fearlessly among the powerful animals. She was not just calming them, she was communicating with them, her touch and her soft melodic words a balm to their primal terror. At the height of the storm, a bolt of lightning struck a tall pine on the ridge, splitting it with a deafening crack. The horses panicked. One of the geldings reared, its eyes wild, its hooves flailing. It crashed against the stall door, splintering the wood. Jacob lunged for the bridle, but Lynn was faster. She darted under the horse's neck, a shockingly dangerous move, and pressed her fingers into a spot at the base of his jaw. The horse shuddered and dropped back to all fours, his panicked breathing slowing. She stood with him, her forehead pressed against his, until the trembling stopped. Jacob watched, his own heart pounding. In that moment, she was not a fragile girl in a white dress. She was a force of nature, as powerful and untamed as the storm outside. The rain hammered on the roof, a relentless drumbeat, but inside the stable a profound quiet had fallen. The bond between them, an unspoken thing of shared duty and grudging respect, had been forged into something stronger. It was an alliance of 2 solitary people against a world that sought to break them. Thorn did not wait long to make his next move. A few nights after the storm, Jacob was woken by a sound that every rancher dreads, the splintering of fence posts and the frantic drumming of hooves. He grabbed his Winchester and was out the door in a heartbeat, Lynn right behind him, her face pale in the moonlight. Thorn's men had cut the fence to the far pasture. The entire herd was pouring out into the open country, running blind and panicked into the darkness. A stampede in the black of night was a death sentence for the horses and financial ruin for him. It was a classic tactic. Create a disaster, then ride in the next day to buy up the broken pieces for pennies on the dollar. "Stay here," he ordered Lynn, his voice sharp. "It's too dangerous." He started for his saddle horse, but she grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she said, her voice ringing with an authority he had never heard from her before. "They follow Obsidian. He is the lead stallion. Where he goes, they go. We do it together." Before he could argue, she ran into the stable. A moment later she emerged, not on a saddled horse, but on Obsidian's bare back, her hands tangled in his long mane. The stallion, though still lean from his sickness, moved with a renewed power, his loyalty to the woman on his back absolute. Jacob didn't waste another second. He saddled his own mare, and they rode out into the night, two figures against the vast, moonlit landscape. They rode, not to chase, but to guide. Lynn took the lead, her voice cutting through the chaos. It was not a shout, but a call, a series of high, piercing notes that Jacob had never heard before. It was the language of the herd. Slowly, miraculously, the panicked horses began to respond. They turned their heads toward the sound, their pace slowing. Lynn, on Obsidian, moved to the head of the stampede, her white dress a ghostly banner in the darkness. She and the black stallion acted as one, turning the herd, guiding them away from the treacherous gullies and back toward the open pasture. Jacob rode the flank, his rifle laid across his lap, his eyes scanning the shadows for Thorne's men. He saw them, two riders watching from a distant rise, their plan unraveling before their eyes. They had expected a lone, desperate man. They had not expected this. It took them the rest of the night, but by dawn the entire herd was back in the repaired pasture, exhausted and skittish, but safe. Jacob and Lynn sat on their horses as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. They were covered in sweat and grime, their bodies aching with fatigue. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her profile, the set of her jaw. She had not just helped him, she had led him. She had saved him. "You were right," he said, his voice raw. "We did it together." She finally turned to look at him, a tired but genuine smile gracing her lips. "We are a good herd," she replied. The simple truth of her words settled deep in his bones. They were no longer just two people. They were a partnership, a herd of two, and they were ready for the fight to come. The morning after the failed stampede, the air was still and heavy, pregnant with violence. Jacob knew Thorne would not take the failure well. His pride had been wounded, and a man like Thorne was most dangerous when his ego was bruised. They spent the day preparing, not for a fight, but for a siege. Jacob boarded up the two windows on the back of the cabin, leaving only small slits to see through. He checked his ammunition, his hands moving with the steady, practiced motions of a soldier. Lynn did not busy herself with the house. Instead, she was with the horses. She moved them from the outer pasture into the main corral, right next to the stable. She spent hours with them, walking among them, speaking to them, her touch a constant reassurance. Jacob watched her, puzzled by her methods. He was preparing for a battle of men. She seemed to be preparing the animals. "They should be further out," he told her, gesturing to the corral. "If they're shooting, they'll be trapped here." She shook her head, her expression resolute. "They are safer with us. They are family. They will help." He didn't understand what she meant, but he had learned to trust her instincts. Her knowledge ran deeper than his, a current that flowed from a different, older world. The waiting was the worst part. The sun beat down, the cicadas buzzed, and every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. They ate a midday meal in tense silence, the food tasteless in their mouths. Afterwards, Jacob took up a position by the front window of the cabin, his Winchester resting on the sill. Lynn went back to the stable, but she did not hide. She stood in the wide open doorway, her arms crossed, watching the road. She was a sentry, her small frame a defiant challenge to the emptiness. They came in the late afternoon, when the sun was a merciless eye in the sky. Thorne rode in the lead, his silver mare prancing nervously. He had 6 men with him this time. a small army of hired guns with hard, empty faces. They fanned out as they approached, surrounding the cabin and the stable. It was a show of overwhelming force, meant to intimidate, to crush any thought of resistance. Thorne trotted his horse forward and stopped just out of easy rifle range. "Vance!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the still air. "This foolishness ends today. You will sign over the deed to this pathetic scrap of land. You will give me the stallion, and you will give me the girl. Do this, and I will let you walk away with your life." Jacob sighted down the barrel of his Winchester, the bead settling squarely on Thorne's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end this right now. But he was not a murderer. He was a soldier, a survivor. He would not fire the first shot. "This is my home, Thorne," he yelled back, his voice carrying across the yard. "These are my horses, and that is my wife. You'll get none of it." Thorne laughed, that same ugly, grating sound. "Have it your way, you stubborn fool." He raised his hand, about to give the signal to his men. But before he could drop it, Lynn acted. She let out a sharp, piercing whistle, the same call she had used during the stampede. But this time it was not a call to soothe. It was a command, a signal. From inside the stable, Obsidian let out a furious, trumpeting cry. Then the stable doors, which Lynn had unlatched, burst open. Not just one horse, but the entire herd, a dozen powerful animals, surged out of the stable and into the corral. They were not panicked. They were a cavalry charge. They slammed against the corral fence, the one closest to Thorne's men. It was an old fence, and under the combined weight of 12 charging horses, the rails snapped like twigs. The herd poured out, a wave of horseflesh and fury, directly into the flank of Thorne's men. The gunmen's horses, already on edge, screamed and scattered. 2 men were unseated immediately, trampled under the thundering hooves. The disciplined line of attack dissolved into chaos. It was a brilliant, insane strategy, turning Thorne's greatest prize against him. In the confusion, the shooting started. A bullet splintered the window frame next to Jacob's head, showering him with wood. He fired back, not aiming to kill, but to drive them back. He saw Lynn dart from the stable entrance, running toward the cabin. One of Thorne's men, recovering his mount, saw her too. He raised his pistol, taking aim at her back. "Lynn!" Jacob screamed. He fired without thinking, his shot going wide, but it was enough to make the gunman flinch. It wasn't enough. The man fired. Lynn cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and stumbled, clutching her arm. A searing, white-hot rage, unlike anything Jacob had ever known, consumed him. He vaulted through the window, landing in a crouch in the dirt, his Winchester already at his shoulder. The world narrowed to the man who had hurt her. He fired once. The man tumbled from his saddle and did not move again. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining men, their nerve broken, fled in a disorganized rout. But the battle was not won. Thorne, his face a mask of apoplectic fury, had dismounted and was now stalking toward the cabin, his eyes locked on Lynn, who was struggling to her feet. The yard was a scene of chaos. Riderless horses galloped in panic circles while the dust settled in the blood-red light of the setting sun. Jacob's focus was singular. He ran to Lynn, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached her side, his eyes scanning the wound. The bullet had torn through the flesh of her upper arm. It was bleeding badly, staining the sleeve of her white dress a horrifying crimson, but it looked clean. It had gone through. "I'm all right," she gasped, her face pale with shock and pain, but her eyes were clear and defiant. He helped her to her feet, his arm securely around her waist, supporting her. His rage had cooled, replaced by a cold, deadly calm. He looked up to see Thorn marching toward them, his fancy coat gone, his face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. He had a small, silver-plated derringer in his hand. "You!" Thorn spat, his voice trembling with fury. He pointed the pistol not at Jacob, but at Lynn. "You worthless creature! You and your filthy animal tricks! I should have drowned you like a runt when I had the chance." Before Jacob could raise his rifle, a sound like thunder erupted from the stable. Obsidian, his eyes rolling, his teeth bared, charged from the shadows. He was no longer a horse. He was an avenging spirit, a storm of black muscle and righteous fury. The stallion that Thorn had coveted, the animal he had tried to steal, the creature whose life Lynn had saved, was now coming for him. Thorn had time for one wide-eyed moment of terror. He tried to raise the pathetic little pistol, but it was useless. Obsidian reared up, his massive form blotting out the sky, his front hooves transformed into lethal weapons. He struck once, a devastating blow to Thorn's chest. The sound of breaking bone was sickeningly loud in the sudden silence. Thorn was thrown backward, landing in a crumpled heap, the derringer flying from his grasp. He lay still. Obsidian snorted, a plume of hot air misting in the cooling evening. He trotted over to Lynn and nudged her gently with his nose, his earlier fury replaced by a soft, concerned whicker. He was her guardian, her champion. Jacob stared at the scene, his mind struggling to process it. He had not defeated Thorn. The land had not defeated him. The horse had. The very life that Lynn had nurtured had risen to defend her. It was a form of justice so pure and elemental it left him breathless. He gently turned Lynn away from the sight, leading her toward the cabin. "Come on," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's get you patched up." Inside, as he carefully cleaned and bandaged her wound by the warm light of a kerosene lamp, their hands touched. It was not the first time, but this time it was different. An electric current passed between them, an acknowledgment of everything they had survived. He looked into her eyes, and he saw not a mail-order bride, not a servant, but his partner, his equal, his wife in the only way that mattered. He leaned in, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. He pressed his lips to hers, a kiss that was not about passion, but about gratitude and relief and a profound, bone-deep recognition of a shared soul. In the months that followed, the brutal heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of a Montana autumn. The land, which had been so harsh and unforgiving, seemed to soften, offering up a quiet beauty that Jacob had not allowed himself to see for many years. The shadow of Bartholomew Thorn was gone. The county sheriff had come out, taken one look at the scene, listened to Jacob's clipped, factual account, and declared it a case of a trespasser meeting a predictable end. Thorn's empire, built on fear and greed, crumbled without him, his hired guns scattering to the wind. The valley was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace. The ranch began to thrive. With Lynn's intuitive knowledge, the horses were healthier and stronger than ever before. Word of the Vance Ranch's remarkable stock, particularly the legendary black stallion who had recovered from the brink of death, began to spread. Buyers came, not with threats, but with respect, and paid fair prices. Jacob used the money to buy more land, to build a new, stronger fence, and to add a proper wing onto the cabin for his wife. Their life fell into a rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the animals. They worked side by side from sun up to sundown, a partnership of few words but deep understanding. He learned the meaning of the different herbs she gathered, and she learned to bake the kind of bread his mother used to make. Their evenings were spent on the porch, watching the stars blanket the vast dark sky. Sometimes she would tell him stories of her home, of a world of green mountains and ancient traditions, and he would listen, mesmerized by the sound of her voice. He taught her more English, and she taught him the names of the constellations. One evening, as they sat watching the herd graze in the twilight, Obsidian trotted up to the porch and rested his head on the railing, looking at them with his intelligent eyes. Lynn reached out and stroked his face, a gesture of deep affection. "He is happy," she said, her English now fluid and confident. "This is a good home." Jacob looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the curve of her cheek, at the quiet strength that radiated from her. He thought of the desperate, broken man he had been, ready to put a bullet in his last hope. He thought of the fragile-looking girl who had stepped off the stage, a woman the world had deemed worthless. She had saved his horse. She had saved his ranch. And in doing so, she had saved him. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with a gratitude that was too vast for words. "It is." He reached out and took her hand, their fingers lacing together, a comfortable, familiar gesture. They were a herd of two, in a valley they had fought for, under a sky that held no more threats, only promises. The story of Jacob Vance and Lynn Way is more than just a tale of survival on the frontier. It's a testament to the idea that true worth is not something that can be bought or sold, or judged by the narrow minds of others. It is proven in quiet competence, in fierce loyalty, and in the courage to stand for what is right, even when you stand alone. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the gentlest hands, and that the most profound connections are forged not in words, but in shared struggle and unwavering trust. If this story of an unlikely partnership and the wild heart of the American West resonated with you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who appreciates a story of courage and resilience. And for more tales from the frontier that history books often forget, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Jacob and Lynn's story stood out to you the most? Let us know in the comments below.